Okay, here's the hat and here's Harry. What is it going to say? Brocklehurst Mandy went to Ravenclaw too, but Brown Lavender became the first new Gryffindor, and the table on the far left exploded with cheers. Harry could see Ron's twin brothers catcalling. Bulstrode Maleficent then became a Slytherin. Perhaps it was Harry's imagination after all he'd heard about Slytherin, but he thought they looked an unpleasant lot. He was starting to feel definitely sick now. He remembered being picked for teams during sports lessons at his old school. He'd always been last to be chosen, not because he was no good, but because no one wanted Dudley to think they liked him. Finch Fletchley Justin. Hufflepuff! Sometimes Harry noticed the hat shouted out the house at once, but at others it took a little while to decide. Finnegan Seamus, the sandy-haired boy next to Harry in the line, sat on the stool for almost a whole minute before the hat declared him a Gryffindor. Granger, Hermione. Hermione almost ran to the stool and jammed the hat eagerly on her head. Gryffindor! Shouted the hat. Ron groaned. A horrible thought struck Harry, as horrible thoughts always do when you're very nervous. What if he wasn't chosen at all? What if he just sat there with the hat over his eyes for ages until Professor McGonagall jerked it off his head and said there had obviously been a mistake and he'd better get back on the train? When Neville Longbottom, the boy who kept losing his toad, was called, he fell over on his way to the stool. The hat took a long time to decide with Neville. When it finally shouted, Gryffindor, Neville ran off, still wearing it, and had to jog back amid gales of laughter to give it to McDougal Morag. Malfoy swaggered forward when his name was called, and it got his wish at once. The hat had barely touched his head when it screamed, Slytherin! Malfoy went to join his friends, Crabbe and Goyle, looking pleased with himself. There wasn't many people left now. Moon, Nott, Parkinson, then a pair of twin girls, Patel and Patel, then Perk, Sally Ann, then at last Potter, Harry. As Harry stepped forward, the whispers suddenly broke out like little hissing fires all over the hall. Potter, did they say? The Harry Potter? The last thing Harry saw before the hat dropped over his eyes was a hall full of people craning to get a good look at him. Next second he was looking at the black inside the hat, and he waited. Said a small voice in his ear. Difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind either. There's talent. Oh, my goodness, yes. There's a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So where shall I put you? Harry gripped the edges of the stool and thought, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh? Said the small voice. Are you sure? You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head, and Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. No doubt about that. No, well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor! And Harry heard the hat shout the last word to the whole hall. He took off the hat and walked shakily toward the Gryffindor table. He was so relieved to have been chosen and not put in Slytherin, he hardly noticed that he was getting the loudest cheer yet. Percy, the prefect, got up and shook his hand vigorously, while the Weasley twins yelled, We got Potter! We got Potter! Harry sat down opposite the ghost in the ruff he'd seen earlier. The ghost patted his arm, giving Harry the sudden horrible feeling he'd just plunged into a bucket of ice, cold water. He could see the high table properly now. At the end nearest him sat Hagrid, who caught his eye and gave him the thumbs up. Harry grinned back, and there in the center of the high table, in a large gold chair, sat Albus Dumbledore. Harry recognized him at once from the card he got out of the chocolate frog on the train. Dumbledore's silver hair was the only thing in the whole hall that shone as brightly as the ghost's. Harry spotted Professor Quirrell, too, the nervous young man from the Leaky Cauldron. He was looking very peculiar in a large purple turban, and now there were only 3 people left to be sorted. Turpin Lisa became a Ravenclaw, and then it was Ron's turn. He was pale green by now, and Harry crossed his fingers under the table, and a second later the hat shouted, Gryffindor! Harry clapped loudly with the rest as Ron collapsed into the chair next to him. Well done, Ron. Excellent, said Percy Weasley pompously across Harry as Zambini Blaze was made a Slytherin. Professor McGonagall rolled up her scroll, took the sorting hat away. Harry looked down at his empty gold plate. He had only just realized how hungry he was. The pumpkin pasty seemed ages ago. Albus Dumbledore had got to his feet. He was beaming at the students, his arms opened wide, as if nothing could have pleased him more than to see them all there. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words, and here they are: Nitwit, Blubber, Oddment, Tweak. Thank you." And he sat back down. Everybody clapped and cheered. Harry didn't know whether to laugh or not. "Is he a bit mad?" he asked Percy uncertainly. "Mad?" said Percy airily. "He's a genius, best wizard in the world. But he's a bit mad, yes. Potatoes, Harry?" Harry's mouth fell open. The dishes in front of him were now piled with food. He had never seen so many things he liked to eat on the table. Roast beef, roast chicken, pork chops and lamb chops, sausages, bacon and steak, boiled potatoes, roast potatoes, chips, Yorkshire pudding, peas, carrots, gravy, ketchup, and for some strange reason, mint humbugs. The Dursleys had never exactly starved Harry, but he'd never been allowed to eat as much as he liked. Dudley had always taken anything that Harry really wanted, even if it made him sick. Harry piled his plate with a bit of everything except the humbugs and began to eat. It was all delicious. That does look good," said the ghost in a ruff sadly, watching Harry cut up his steak. "Can't you?" "I haven't eaten for nearly 500 years," said the ghost. "I don't need to, of course, but one does miss it. I don't think I've introduced myself. Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington at your service, resident ghost of Gryffindor Tower." "I know who you are," said Ron suddenly. "My brothers told me about you. You're Nearly Headless Nick." "I would prefer to call me Sir Nicholas de Mimsy," the ghost began stiffly, but sandy-haired Seamus Finnegan interrupted. "Nearly headless? How can you be nearly headless?" Sir Nicholas looked extremely miffed, as if their little chat wasn't going at all the way he wanted. "Like this," he said irritably, and he seized his left ear and pulled. His whole head swung off his neck and fell onto his shoulder as if it was on a hinge. Someone had obviously tried to behead him, but not done it properly. Looking pleased at the stunned looks on their faces, Nearly Headless Nick flipped his head back on his neck, coughed, and said, "So, new Gryffindors, I hope you're going to help us win the house championship this year. Gryffindor have never gone so long without winning. Slytherin have got the cup 6 years in a row. The Bloody Baron's become almost unbearable. He's the Slytherin ghost." Harry looked over at the Slytherin table and saw a horrible ghost sitting there with blank staring eyes, a gaunt face, and robes stained with silver blood. He was right next to Malfoy, who Harry was pleased to see didn't look too pleased with the seating arrangements. "How did he get covered in blood?" asked Seamus with great interest. "I've never asked," said Nearly Headless Nick. When everyone had eaten as much as they could, the remains of the food faded from the plates, leaving them sparkling clean as before. A moment later the puddings appeared, blocks of ice cream in every flavor you could think of, apple pies, treacle tarts, chocolate eclairs, and jam donuts, trifle, strawberries, jelly, rice pudding. As Harry helped himself to a treacle tart, the talk turned to their families. "I'm half and half," said Seamus. "Me dad's a muggle. Mam didn't tell him she was a witch till after they were married. Bit a nasty shock for him." And the others laughed. "What about you, Neville?" said Ron. "Well, my Gram brought me up, and she's a witch," said Neville, "but the family thought I was all muggle for ages. My great-uncle Algy kept trying to catch me off my guard and force some magic out of me. He pushed me off the end of Blackpool Pier once. I nearly drowned, but nothing happened until I was 8. Great-uncle Algy came round for tea, and he was hanging me out of an upstairs window by the ankles, when my great-auntie Enid offered him a meringue, and he accidentally let go. But I bounced all the way down the garden and into the road. They were all really pleased. Gran was crying, she was so happy, and you should have seen their faces when I got in here. They thought I might not be magic enough to come, you see. Great-uncle Algy was so pleased he bought me my toad." On Harry's other side, Percy Weasley and Hermione were talking about lessons. "I do hope they start straight away. There's so much to learn. I'm particularly interested in transfiguration. You know, turning something into something else. Of course, it's supposed to be very difficult. You'll be starting small, just matches into needles and that sort of thing." Harry, who was starting to feel warm and sleepy, looked up at the high table again. Hagrid was drinking deeply from the goblet. Professor McGonagall was talking to Professor Dumbledore. Professor Quirrell, in his absurd turban, was talking to the teacher with greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and sallow skin. It happened very suddenly. The hook-nosed teacher looked past Quirrell's turban straight into Harry's eyes, and a sharp, hot pain shot across the scar on Harry's head. Ouch! Harry clapped his hand to his head. What is it? Asked Percy. Nothing. The pain had gone as quickly as it had come. Harder to shake off was the feeling Harry had got from the teacher's look, a feeling that he didn't like Harry at all. "Who's that teacher talking to Professor Quirrell?" he asked Percy. "Oh, you know Quirrell already, do you? No wonder he's looking so nervous. That's Professor Snape. He teaches potions, but he doesn't want to. Everyone knows he's after Quirrell's job. Knows an awful lot about the dark arts, Snape." Harry watched Snape for a while, but Snape didn't look at him again. At last the puddings too disappeared, and Professor Dumbledore got to his feet again. The hall fell silent. Just a few more words now. We are all fed and watered. I have a few start of term notices to give you. And that's where we'll stop for today.